Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and apologies I haven't made a video in a while. I'll talk more about that in the end. Nothing too bad has happened. So on to the topic at hand. So we're going to be talking about rules today and rule sets. Now I'm talking about experience coming from historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short, and thus applying to HEMA, but you know, different factors can apply from other sports. And indeed, if you think of anything from your rule sets that could maybe help out, if any of you guys out there have experience in, say, LARP or reenactment, things like that, by all means comment. I'd love to know your feedback. But in terms of, from my experience, I've done a few tournaments, and I mean, I'm not going to go out and say I'm particularly good at them, but I know what I'm doing, more or less. You know, I don't die instantly, and I can, you know, I understand a few different rule sets. You know, I've been to events like Wessex League, Fight Camp, May Melee, Swords and Cider, things like that. So I've had some experience of different rule sets and heard from different people about, you know, other ideas and things that have been experimented with on things that I haven't attended. So, of course, there are some really obvious rules which I'll just gloss over, and that'll be to do with stuff like, you know, it'll be usually there's a certain number of people at 1-on-1, 2-on-2, whatever. Other people shouldn't intervene unless it's like a ref saying stop. You know, that kind of stuff, so we'll just sweep that under the carpet. But in terms of the rules that actually do really need defining and are much require more than just a bit of common sense, would be, for example, how much equipment you should wear. Now, when it comes to the weapons, you tend to be a lot more rigid because, you know, you can't have someone with, say, a wooden waster, which is a sort of training sword, up against a steel sword, because it's somewhat unfair. But, of course, you'll have some tournaments which might say, for example, you know, just steel swords, as long as it's not dangerous, you know, it's got some flex to it, it's not as heavy as a sledgehammer, you know, within reason, those sorts of fluid rules, kind of like English law, where they say whatever's reasonable, and then you start thinking what's reasonable. But other times it can get a lot more rigid, unlike the swords, which are supposed to flex. But you might get, for example, you get nylon tournaments, which are, you know, you get plastic training swords, which they don't require as much protection, and it's good for beginners because, you know, if you're up against really beefy guys who are using proper steel swords, it can be pretty intimidating because a lot of them, well, a few of them can't really hold back quite as well as they should, and, you know, you watch two people duking it out. It's quite scary watching what could probably land someone in a hospital. So you get these tournaments with, you know, for sort of that less intense kind of experience. But you can get more general sorts of set rules like nylon weapons. So it'll be ones that, like I say, they flex, they're durable, so not going to break into bits, they're alright, they're sword shaped realistically enough, that sort of stuff. But I've seen tournaments that are very specific, such as, I think it was at Fight Camp, that was it, where you actually have specifically Rawlings. Now, if you don't know, Rawlings are a very specific brand by the namesake David Rawlings. If you look at the London Longsword channel on YouTube, that's the guy himself. But his specific line of recreations are a bit more kind of floppy, noodle-like. I've done a review of them. I kind of like them, kind of don't. But you'll get, I've seen a rule set where it was specifically only those allowed. So if you had other quite similar weapons, like the Black Fencer range, which are, again, training swords made of plastic, also nylon, they wouldn't be accepted in the tournaments. So it's worth bearing in mind that that can apply. And when it comes to protective gear, the actual armour, it can get even more rigid. Which is why if you look at, for example, Spez, one of the manufacturers of things like fencing masks, well, their overlays, things like jackets most especially they're known for, and other such items, you'll actually get these Newton ratings. And that's a sort of rough estimation of if something should happen, like someone's thrusting with a sword and it's quite stiff or they're putting a lot of power into it, or perhaps something unfortunate should happen, like the sword does snap, even though it shouldn't, and then it's trying to penetrate through and skewer someone to death for real. That's where you've got the Newton ratings coming in handy. The most common ones I've encountered are the 350 Newton, which are your more sort of, they're pretty good, and frankly I'm quite satisfied with them. Jackets like the Axel Peterson jacket, some of the other ones like the Night Shop or HEMA Shop, same name for those people, have this line called Red Dragon. They've got some jackets, same kind of thing again, it's padded gambesons, protects your torso and your arms against that sort of thing, and it's usually 350 Newton. But sometimes you'll see equipment that goes up to 800 Newton rating, and even beyond to things like 1,600 and greater. Of course, the higher the rating, the greater the protection. Now, you do get some tournaments that are a little bit more nitpicky about this and want you to go for the higher ratings of protection. And usually, I find with these tournaments, they tend to go on previous experience. So it's like if someone's had a particular kind of injury that required medical attention, suddenly they're extremely precise about that very particular thing, which is why you'll see they might actually ask, you must have at least an 800 Newton rating. Now, my personal opinion, it is up to the person's own discretion. You're still allowed to have more protection than they recommend, but as a minimum, I would probably have it at the 350 Newton rating. I wouldn't go for less, because at that point you're having the ones that are unrated, and that could mean gambesons and things which are perhaps easily torn. You could have a jacket that's good enough that it hasn't been officially rated, but it'll make the grade, and I don't know how you could test that, if that can be done by a judge. That's a bit more tricky. But if you've got something that doesn't have the rating, then it could very well tear up, and again, all it would take is a particularly rough thrust or one of those training weapons to snap, and that can cause very devastating injuries. So I would say that a minimum would be a 350 Newton jacket, like some tournaments do, and something like 800 and plus Newton rating are highly recommended so that you don't die. You get similar things with masks, although that's when it usually requires higher ratings. You've got your typical fencing mask and a bib. The bibs get ratings for puncture protection around the neck, just like the jackets do. And of course, you've got to worry about the fact that the jackets, some of them have little collars that protect your neck, some of them are just like normal clothing and they stop around the sort of, the neckline. But it's very important that there's a good Newton rating, because of the fact that on your torso it's a lot more forgiving. You'd have to actually get cracked ribs or get really skewered for you to take serious injuries, from what I've seen, even though it can hurt a hell of a lot. But with the neck, it's quite fragile, and you could have your windpipe flattened rather easily, which is why I do agree with, if you're using steel weapons, that the tournaments always tell you, from my experience, to have not only the jacket, which hopefully protects the neck to some degree, not mandatorily, fencing mask with a bib that protects sufficiently, and also a gorget, which is something you'd wear underneath the fencing jacket, which then has some kind of hard protection around the neck. Because even if you have a really good bib for the fencing mask, a lot of the design of armour comes around absorption and deflection. So if something deflects, for whatever reason, like a plastron, hard plastic plate, or some real steel armour, someone could go thrust, aim at the torso, or miss thrust to the neck, glance off the top of the chest, around collarbone area, and then go under the bib and skewer your neck with zero protection, which is why gorgets are quite recommended. For non-steel weapons like your nylon, up to your discretion. I would say I'd recommend, of course, the bib is really important. There must be some protection for that fragile area, but I'd recommend something like a gorget, but I've done many fights, including tournaments against people I didn't know, without them, even if I've sometimes thought, maybe I should have. But it's with the plastic ones, it probably won't be bad enough. that an off-angle thrust glancing off will flatten your windpipe, or anything coming directly against the bib will do so, so that should be okay. Apart from that, you do get on the top of the head, sometimes it's just recommended, wear a fencing mask, but to prevent concussions from heavier weapons, especially two-handed swords and especially steel, particularly both, you get these sort of occipital protectors, which are just hoods, and they cover over the fencing mask, and they just basically add as little padding, almost like an upside-down nappy, or diaper as Americans would call it, on top of the head, to pad against blows and just cushion it, just like an arming cap does under the helmet. It's just it's on top of the mask instead of underneath. But I do recommend those for most grades of the weapons, because of the fact that you can just so easily get that whiplash and can get a concussion from it. So I'd always recommend having really top-notch head protection. And on a related note in terms of good protection, gloves. Now, some gloves, you have your 5-finger gloves and you have your sort of mitten gloves, with the mitten gloves usually providing better quality protection. Now, it's interesting to note that a lot of tournaments I've experienced explicitly ban steel gauntlets, and that's because you do get a lot of times people are grappling, they're doing disarms and things, and if someone were to instinctively kind of try to do a push or thump at the mask, you've got this steel glove, bang, and you're basically going to wreck them like a locomotive. Not recommended. Most especially if the person's quite big and strong. But within the non-steel gauntlets, I've found that if you're using long swords in 2 hands of steel, I would recommend having the mitten style. I haven't yet seen any 5-fingered gloves that can sufficiently protect against that full force. With things like sabres and rapiers, it's more up to personal preference. But they always recommend having decent gloves. And if you're looking at going into a tournament, I'd recommend checking that the gloves are suitable for steel. Now, these aren't usually set in the tournament rules with any special ratings, like you get with jackets. That's more, are these suitable for steel? And it's more of a broad category. So if you look at things like the Red Dragon gloves, they're not. They're just not. If you get hit with a steel sword while you're wearing those things, it's going to be quite a bad day. Unless it's something like maybe rapier or some of the lighter steel weapons, in 1 hand. 2 hands, no way. With something like a long sword like this, you're getting your finger smashed to pieces. So, it's worth checking that you have those sorts of gloves that are suitable for the types of weapons they're using. Groin protection, any tournaments, if you're a man, recommend it. Even if you're a woman, I'd probably recommend it. I don't know, I don't have that biology. Upper leg protection, I find is the least enforced, and quite rightly so, because I've taken full force whacks with steel swords, and unlike the arms and the shins, it seems like they're very unlikely to receive any real injuries. You're going to get a good bruise and it's going to come up coloured for quite a while, but it's more optional. But I'd recommend, if you're going against steel swords, have some upper leg protection, like the sort of padded pantaloons and trousers and things. For leg protection on the lower parts, even against nylon swords, I'd recommend shin guards. But interestingly, it's often optional against some weapons in tournaments. For example, if you're looking at sort of nylon weapons most especially, I think in Fight Camp and May Melee I've seen when they've done nylon tournaments, it's not mandatory to have shin guards, but I would recommend it because of the fact that the bone is so close to the surface on the front, and it's quite fragile. It's a bit similar to the forearms, they can get whacked quite a bit. So yeah, that's that about protective gear. I realise I've gone on about that. It's just it's the most in-depth part. Now, on to hitting people. I'm sure everyone wants hitting people. Now, I've seen rule sets that talk about what happens with two-handed swords, and you look at things like one-handed strikes. Now, I was quite annoyed one time in Fight Camp. In fact, I think this is on some footage where I did, I think they call it a Gershlang or something like that. It's a particular technique where you extend your reach and allow for a leg cut, where you basically go into your non-dominant hand, your bottom hand, and you extend out for a cut. So you're using the full reach of the sword, including the pommel, so the longer your grip, the better this works. You know, which for me, as someone who does Fiore stuff, so the hands are not close together, they're very far apart, often on the pommel, this kind of action is very effective. And you can still deliver cuts with good edge alignment, so if it was sharp it would do the real damage. And also with sufficient force, because you can start to propel yourself, and then you just basically, instead of throwing the cut and you're still controlling it in two hands, you're throwing the cut and then at the last second you're sort of letting go with your top hand, and it provides quite a good bit of power in the cut. Saying this, I've experienced a rule set where they don't count, and boy was I not happy. Well, I say that I would accept the rules and just continued, but as a principle I don't like it. But I'm going to mention it because it is a potential rule set, and it's probably to avoid cheap shots, because people would go into something like a one-hand thrust or a one-hand cut with a two-handed sword, which just extends the reach, and it can provide still a fairly powerful stroke or a powerful thrust with the correct structure. Like, for example, you're not sort of kind of stabbing going, you know, you're actually getting into your ready position, you're powering through and putting your body behind it. Same kind of thing, like I said, with the cut. It's effective and I think martially viable, which I think should always be the foundation of a good rule set, where, you know, you don't want to be there going, okay, a flat hit, haha, you slap someone, you're not going to count that as they've been chopped in half, are you? Because it's not realistic. If you did that with a real sword in a real fight, it wouldn't do anything decent. But on the other hand, something like a fully powered attack, yes, that should definitely be counted. So in my opinion, I think it should be allowed, and I have experienced things like, what I quite liked was a version of the rule set in the Wessex League. Now I'm just going to take my jumper off because I'm getting a bit hot. But one of the rule sets in the Wessex League was that if you do a one-handed strike with either hand, and I should probably have mentioned that because in Fight Camp I think they allowed a one-handed strike with your dominant hand, but with the technique to extend the reach I used my non-dominant hand. Anyway, that aside, with the Wessex League, it had that if you did a one-handed strike, it would be the same as its two-handed equivalent, minus a point. So if you're having, say, a thrust to the head, it would normally be 3 points. That's a really decent hit. Minus 1, 2 points. Which is the same as a fully powered cut, you know, clean hit to the forearm. And I think, you know what, that can work. Because you're probably not going to have perfect structure, saying what I said earlier. You know, doing something like a one-handed strike compared to doing it full force with both hands in control the entire time. So I think that's the ideal way to have the rules, rather than just saying no and just discounting it wholesale, which I think is counterintuitive. And also it should be noted that although it is a cheap shot, you know, trying to do that thing to get the extra reach and maybe catch a sneaky leg hit, you know, you've got the areas and the points to count, you know, things like forearm against something like the head points-wise, and it can be counted. You know, there's no such thing as a perfect technique, and the rules should reflect the fact that there's no such thing as a perfect technique. You just allow these things, and people should adapt. So if you're doing that kind of one-handed Gerslag, you then do a low parry and close the distance. It's that simple. You can even step on the blade and make it go to the floor, which is a part of one of Fiore's techniques. I'm sidetracking there, but point is, it's not cheating, it's legit. So I think the rules should reflect that. For other things, you also get doubles and afterblows. Now that is a lot more of a point of contention. One of the reasons why I saved it for later on in the video, for people who are still around, because you're going to be more involved with the rules and that kind of stuff, because it does get really, really difficult to say. And in some manners, it can be that you shouldn't have any one rule set. You should actually have different ones deliberately across tournaments to stop any gaming of the rules. You know, you adapt to one rule set and then you're unprepared for the other. You just have to be a good fighter and then you'll do well across all the rule sets. So that's something to bear in mind first. But for doubles and afterblows, if you don't know, a double hit is two people hit each other at the same time. An afterblow is where you can visually tell the difference, hit, hit. So it's still in the same sort of tempo, so to speak, like I'm in the middle of throwing a cut, I've been hit, I hit. So it's not some sort of, I've been hit, oh, I might get revenge happening much later on. It's definitely, yet they're both going something, one person hits, the other person hits. Maybe a failed counter, for example. I try to parry, oh, I've been hit in the hand, I still hit them in the face in return, sort of thing. Now, there are, I've seen three main ways of doing this with regards to afterblows, so we'll start with. The first one is just discount it, so it becomes a sort of double. So then you say, the fighters were attacking and they didn't defend themselves properly, no points, that's it. Try again. You know, that's bad. Secondly, is where you have some kind of penalty. So, you know, penalty for the first person. So let's say I've hit someone on the head and then they hit me in the body. I don't get as many points because I got hit afterwards. That's one other rule set. And then thirdly, you've just got fully weighted. So I go, ba-bam, I've hit them in the head, they've hit me in the body. It might be 3 points for a head cut, 2 points for a torso cut, I get 1 point, kind of thing. My favourite of this, it's hard to say. In some ways I prefer it just to get... this is what I mean, I can't even agree with myself, never mind other people. But, I mean, let me go over the advantages and disadvantages. If you have it discounted, it means that eventually, for someone to get a hit and for them to score, they must, you know, eventually at the end of the tournament, someone has to make a clean hit, that it's incontestable, unless you've got some tournament rules where the exchanges are counted and then it just carries on, so then maybe some people just both lose and they've got no points, you know, there's no score to carry them on, they don't go on because they've just spent the entire time scoring nothing, like a bad game of football. It's just that with that kind of rule set, it does encourage people to make clean hits and make sure that they do defend themselves. The disadvantage of this is that some people can treat this in an aggressive way, so that they always go for that attack. So either they hit, the other person doesn't hit them, they win, or they hit, they get hit. Well, no one scores anything, so, you know, heads I win, tails I don't lose. And that can game it a bit, because that means all you have to do is just plunge in and just go for a hit and not care if you get hit. The same sort of thing can apply to fully weighted afterblows. So then a person, this can get gamed in the sense that people focus on the high scoring targets. Like, for example, thrusts usually score more and attacks to the head score more. So then I could disregard certain bits of defence, like say my legs, because that might score maybe 2 points or a point, and I can just go, right, focus on the head, he's low, bang! And that can cause bad habits because, excuse me, you've got people who are not defending parts of their body, which in a real fight would bleed, cause debilitating injuries, or later death, and they're just completely ignoring defending them, which is not realistic for a fight, as you can imagine. But it is good on the other hand, because of the fact that the person might make an initial hit and then they can get punished with points being taken away from them, or even, let's say, they're timidly doing a cut to the forearms and in the meantime they haven't defended themselves and bam, a riposte to the head. So even though the defender didn't quite manage to stop themselves being hit, they can punish the other person and make sure they're still winning, which can be a good thing. And then apart from that, you've just got that in some cases you actually see afterblows not counted at all. But again, this can cause the problem of the fact that it's that sport fencing kind of logic where I just need to hit first. One set of rules I saw that was interesting was that if you get 3 in the same sort of, against the same opponent, you get 3 double hits or afterblows, you get disqualified, because at that point you've failed to defend yourself and you've been hit while attacking so often that you would essentially be dead by that point. I do actually like that idea, and I'd wonder if that could be, for an optimum set of rules, you could combine that with something like fully weighted afterblows, so then a person hitting the head scores more than someone hitting the legs, and then they come out better from the exchange. But the rule of being scared to be disqualified, so they're not always just going for it and actually making sure to defend themselves because they're scared of getting, disqualified because of too many double hits, might force them to stop being only offensive and not at all defensive. That's my take on it anyway. I haven't yet seen that exact combination of rules, but that's probably how I'd do it. Mind you, I'm not a tournament ruler. Apart from that, like I said, with doubles, it often becomes that either it's fully weighted or that it's just not, which is being hit at the same time as each other as opposed to hit later. Apart from that, it starts then counting other actions. So we'd be looking at things like, can you grapple? Can you disarm? Can you throw a person? From what I've seen in tournaments, usually grappling and throwing people is disallowed because it's just too dangerous. You can have, even steel swords, and as long as you pad yourself out like the Michelin tyres man, you can smack each other about, and the worst you get is a bit of bruising somewhere, and maybe a bit of a hurt, ego, but that's it. Whereas when it comes to grappling, of course, that needs control and technique. Not just for the sake of the martially viable stuff, which is, getting the other person out of control while you are in control, but there's also the aspect of control for the sake of safety, where, for example, you're not snapping anybody's necks, you're not breaking their limbs, or even just causing them to fall in a way that they land on their head or their neck, because that can cause concussions and other bad things to happen. How do you set up rules that account for that? And if a person tries to do those rules, they could do it imperfectly, and it could still end up going nasty, and people die, and you can see where I'm coming from here. It's, in an ideal world, there would be some sort of way where you could include grappling, because it's a realistic aspect, where you're not just fighting at distance, ding, 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 I'm hitting people towards the tip of my sword, bang, 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 all of this usual fancy stuff, but actually maybe closing in and going around and, throwing the opponent to the floor so I can then threaten them with a point, make them surrender. That's realistic in a martial sense, but I haven't yet seen any rules that allow that to be accommodated without the imminent risk of danger from people grappling in some sort of dangerous manner. So I personally would just not allow it. However, as some tournaments like the Wessex League do allow, and I think Fight Camp and the main Melee do too, and I reckon they would in Swords and Cider, definitely, disarms. That's a lot simpler. So at that point you're not trying to do joint locks and things that can cause dislocations and breaks. You're not doing things that can cause a lot of hazardous problems that are very chaotic in the midst of a fight with all the adrenaline going. A disarm is much simpler than that. It's just control the weapon and take it from the other person. And yes, to some degree you do have to break the opponent's structure. So, for example, one of the disarms that you do against a dagger or a one-handed sword, and actually can work against a two-handed sword, is that you're going against the thumb joint and you're twisting around this way until eventually it's just coming free from their hands. But you can do it in a much more controlled manner, usually before it gets to that point where maybe their gloves are being caught up and it might twist their hands so much it dislocates. You can pretty much just kind of wrench and, rather than wrenching the arm or whatever itself so that it causes danger to the wielder, you can do it in a way where kind of you can feel that they've got a weak grip, and then at that point you can pretty much just take it outwards and bring in the weapon towards you, and it's yours, with very little resistance. Even if their gloves are getting caught up, typically what happens at that point is either just it closes in so much, you've got the person bound up and their weapon, so you're free, cut the leg or pommel strike to the face, or threaten them with the point and say, look, I win, and everyone agrees they won. Or something will happen like the sword comes out easily enough despite it being initially tangled. And the third, my favourite, which I have seen happen before, which is it gets caught up in the glove or the other equipment, and then it just comes free. So you've not only disarmed the sword, you've taken a free glove too. But seriously though, it doesn't usually cause actual problems as long as you're doing it, with a degree of care and caution, which I know is difficult to ask from strangers, but strange enough, it does usually work out well enough compared with grappling, which is more chaotic and dangerous. Besides that, you get certain, we'll talk about scoring actually, I haven't mentioned about targets. So I mentioned before, you do sometimes you might get a simple rule set, which is people hitting each other, and it's just, did you get hit? So maybe a double hit, no point. I hit you, I didn't get hit. I gain a point, or maybe there are lives, you lose a point type of thing. So it's just that simple, hit someone, don't get hit yourself, which is a nice simple rule set, which is good for judges because, they're watching this chaos of steel and plastic and bits going everywhere, and they can just see they've been hit, okay, as opposed to other rule sets which go on points for specific targets. So let's take the example of the Wessex League. I'm using that a lot because it's the most recent tournament I did, so it's fresher in my mind. Cut to the head, 3 points. Thrust to the torso or thrust to the head, 3 points. Cut to the torso or the limbs, 2 points. And like I mentioned, one-handed strike for two-handed sword. Nearest equivalent, minus a point. So, cut to the head, 2 points instead of 3 kind of thing. That can work quite well, and it does help people to prioritise. So you get people like me who are cheeky hand carvers, and if it was just a simple system of did they get hit, did you get hit, then it encourages someone like myself to just go, I'm not going to risk it, cut to the hands, medium power, not tippy-tappy stuff that wouldn't get scored because that's just not martially viable again. But, medium stroke, it'd probably cause a nasty scarring wound, might weaken their hand for a bit and need a few months to recover, but not anything particularly deadly. I win, as opposed to actually committing and trying something realistically powerful, like a thrust into the face for your race style. It can, if you don't have that point system, it can end up discouraging people from trying those more deadly and more cool techniques. So it ends up not looking as nice in a tournament, and it can end up being a problem where people just take cheap shots. Cut to the leg, I didn't get hit, I win. Cut to the hands, I didn't get hit, I win. Little, oops, I snipped I snipped your little finger off, well, it's a hit, I win, don't care. As opposed to going for it properly. But it is a problem trying to score things with locations like, cuts and thrusts to the face and the torso and all that kind of stuff, because then you actually rely on the judges, even if you've got multiple line judges, so different people from different angles. It is difficult in the chaos of what's going on, and especially when you don't know what's going to happen. You can see people doing a feint. You don't know if that's going to be a real hit, whether you need to pay attention to it, or if it's just kind of gesturing while the other person does something else, or if it's suddenly bang, and within a fraction of a second, a thing has happened. How are you supposed to pay attention to that and score it? Which is where it becomes a problem. It's a good idea in theory where you should score exact body parts and the types of hit and the quality of hit, but it's very difficult when you're the judge because you've got to actually examine that in the precise moment, and of course when you've got things like double hits, Was that parried? You know, did that hit their hand or the crossguard on that? Damn. You know, was that ding? I bounced off your hand and cut into it and then went into the crossguard. Was that ding? It was parried. Don't score that. You know, it gets really difficult, and I don't envy the job of a judge, frankly. I even did some judge training. I thought, good grief, this is going to be a struggle for me. But as a hypothetical rule set, imagining you had people who had eagle eyes and could slow down time with their minds and could watch the exact quality of hits, yeah, of course, it'd be perfect. Then you can get good quality hits and things like that, and give more points and more awards to people who actually do really nice, you know, a thrust to the face, wow, go fiore, or, you know, whether it's something really cool, like you know, all these things, as opposed to cut to the hands, yeah, a few points, yeah. But apart from that, what else can you have in rules? No, that's it, basically. And apart from that, you might have other items. So I have seen things like sword and dagger type tournaments, especially rapier and side sword. So, you know, that and buckler as well. And then finally, you just have to think about, do those score? Like, say, I've got a sword and a buckler. I'm doing all this parry or past, nobody's cut or thrust anything, and I'm close and I go bang, and I punch them in the face with the buckler, or maybe I use the edge of the shield to go ding, which is martially viable and could cause a concussion, stuff like that. Do you score that? Do you not score that? You know, things like that. That's something that can be considered. I'm on the fence about that because I haven't seen much of it going on, so it's difficult to say whether it's something that would be particularly martially viable, or whether it's just too much of a hassle, or maybe if it's going to be dangerous. I don't really know. With things like daggers, it's a bit simpler. The Wessex League I saw, I think it was, if you got any action with the dagger, you know, like a thrust, if it had to be a thrust, and it would just give you 1 point straight. I think I'd treat some sort of offhand weapon like a dagger in the same way as the sword, personally. So rather than, you know, I've got a rapier, I thrust to the face, 3 points, I think, you know, so then dagger, thrust to the face, 1 point? No, I don't think so. You know, in terms of what it would do in a real sword fight, I'm not someone who's been in a real fight, real blade fight anyway, I've been in a fist fight, but being stabbed in the face with a dagger, I reckon would do quite a bit of harm, don't you? You know, I personally would score a secondary item like a dagger the same way as with a sword. If you had some raw sets, like for example with rapier, you were saying, you know, maybe you had certain heavier rapiers, or maybe side swords, arming swords, or sabres, and you had a cut does damage. Maybe you could say that a dagger you can't exactly chop, you know, you can't say, yeah. With some daggers, usually parrying daggers were very thrust oriented, bearing in mind. So if you went chop, there'd be a little slice, it wouldn't really do much. It would hurt, it would cause a scar, but it's not really debilitating, oh, I can't use my arm anymore. So I'd think maybe adjust the rules appropriate to the type of item you've got. Like, let's say if you had a sabre and a flintlock pistol simulator, and you were saying it's an empty gun to simulate boarding action, I've already shot it off. Maybe you could say, if you strike with a pistol, it gives a point because it's representing maybe, you know, a whack of a club or something. Or something equivalent to a pommel or basket strike, because it's a heavy object, hitting them in the face, yeah, score it. But if you've got the same equivalent, like, I stabbed them to the face with a sword, 3 points. I stabbed them to the face with a dagger, yeah, also 3 points, I think. So, and also bearing in mind, it's not exactly like it would be particularly exploitable, because the offhand weapon is either another sword and, you know, some other large item that's significant. And in these sorts of tournaments, you typically see the opponent, you know, both people having the same thing. So it's not like a lopsided duel. I can do the same thing as he or she can. We've both got the same opportunities. But even with something like a dagger against a rapier, if I'm smart enough and fast enough where I can actually close the distance to a range where we're not using swords, but a dagger, frankly, that's not something to be admonished, but admired. It's, you know, it's something where you've used skill. You've covered yourself on the way in. You've gone around. You've gained control. You can stab with a dagger. That is actually pretty decent in a sword fight. If you don't believe me, you go to some sort of sparring situation, you know, maybe in LARP or in AIM or whatever. You gave yourself maybe just a rolled up piece of newspaper or some plastic training dagger or some item. And you try to take that against someone who's got a sword. Even if they're a complete beginner, they'll realise, I'll jab at you, or I'll just do this kind of figure eight, stay away, I'm just going to go back. You have to charge in against someone who's possibly coming back in reaction to you charging, even if you've got a sword and they're not realising about the dagger. It's just a natural reaction back away from me. You've got to charge in, and you've got to, you know, make sure you're getting that stab, and if they've got an offhand weapon, they don't take you offline. You know, they don't, you know, they've got two hands just like you have, except in some circumstances. It's very admirable. So again, I would definitely score, you know, I wouldn't do some sort of penalty to using an offhand weapon if that's part of the tournament, because otherwise just don't include them, you know, like rapier or sabre single, and you've just got nothing in your offhand. If you're going to include those items like a flintlock, a club, a dagger equivalent in a tournament, I'd say just fully score it as if it was the main weapon and treat it as appropriate for what it does. Like, you know, maybe the dagger's not very good at swinging, but you can still thrust of it, so you only count the thrusts, kind of things. You can easily accommodate this stuff in the rules in the same way as you do it with main weapon. But yeah, I'm babbling on a bit about that. You get the idea. So that's that, and that's it for today. Now, just if you just wanted to talk about rules, you can probably end the video here. But if you're one of my regular viewers, so what's been happening in my life? I haven't died, or well, obviously I'm alive. But I haven't been ill or anything particularly bad, I just got distracted. One of the main things is I had my birthday on the 9th of October. I'm 27 now, woo! And I've also been doing some blacksmithing and stuff, and the weather's been a bit bad, so hence I've ended up kind of forgetting to do videos, or I've had really poor conditions. I mean, there's not a great amount of natural light now, and it's the middle of the day, you know. I've moved the clock because it keeps ticking, but it's probably about 1 or 2 in the afternoon right now, and it's, you know, this used to be about the same light level as you'd get 6 in the evening a couple of months ago. So it's been a bit difficult getting videos recorded, so apologies about that, but hopefully I'll get back into the swing of things. That's that. If you've gotten this far in a video, comment the number 57 just so I know how many people actually bothered watching this all the way through, and apart from that, maybe include something about the rules. Well, hey, so that's that. See you in the next video. Ta-ra for now.